The lunch box was second-hand, a battered steel rectangle that Marcus Webb had bought from a departing human diplomat 3 months ago, back when he'd still believed that fitting in at the V3 Academy might be a matter of purchasing the right equipment. It had a dent in one corner and a faded sticker of a red mountain on the lid, and it clattered against his hip every time he walked down the corridor, announcing his presence the way a bell announces the arrival of something that does not belong. He did not belong. He had stopped arguing with that fact around week 6. The Academy of Biological Sciences on Vether Prime was old, older than most human nations, older than the written language of 2 separate alien civilizations, old enough that the stone floors of the main hall had been worn smooth by the passage of 100,000 scholars who had never seen a human, and had not, in many cases, been particularly interested in starting. The ceilings were high. The light came through amber-tinted panels that softened everything to the color of old honey. The other students were V3, tall and thin-limbed and silver-skinned, with wide pale eyes built for low-light conditions, and a habit of going perfectly, unnervingly still when they were thinking hard about something. Marcus was none of those things. He was medium height, dark-haired, and built like someone who had spent his adolescence on a farming settlement, which he had. He got cold easily. He laughed too loudly. He took up more space than he meant to, and when he walked into a seminar room, the chairs were never quite the right size for his frame, so he spent lectures slightly hunched, his knees angled out, looking vaguely apologetic about his own skeleton. He had applied to the academy on the advice of his undergraduate advisor back on Kepler Station, a human woman who had done 3 years of xenobiology fieldwork on Vether, and who had said to him, with the directness of someone who respects your time, "Your observational instincts are better than anyone I've taught in a decade. The V3 program will ruin you for anything else. Also, they will hate the way you sit in chairs." She had been right on all 3 counts. The academy accepted approximately 200 students per year. It had, in 4 centuries of operation, accepted exactly 1 human. Marcus had received the acceptance letter on a Wednesday and spent the following Sunday helping his grandmother with the sheep, because she had asked him to, and because he was, at his core, someone who did the thing that needed doing when it needed doing. She had pressed the photograph into his hands at the end of the day and told him to remember that intelligence was common and knowledge was earnable, but the willingness to say the thing out loud was rare, and he should not waste it. He had thought about her a great deal in his first 4 months at the academy, mostly in the context of wondering what she would have made of a place where the library contained the digitized memory impressions of 2,000 years of scholars, accessible through an interface that felt like reading someone's mind, and where the cafeteria operated on a schedule calibrated to a species that ate twice a day, and found the human habit of 3 meals with snacks between them moderately alarming. The memory archive system was the thing that had struck him most, walking in. The V3 had developed it a century ago, a way of preserving not just knowledge but the associative texture of knowing it, the way a discovery felt when it was made, the connections a researcher drew between disparate fields. Every licensed scholar deposited their research findings into it. Every major publication was cross-referenced against it. It was, Professor Korath had said in the first seminar Marcus attended, the greatest scientific instrument his species had ever built. It was also, as Marcus had since discovered, subject to the same problem as every other archive in every civilization he'd ever read about. It was only as honest as the people who operated it. He was also, by the formal assessment of Professor Dale Korath, the Academy's most decorated xenobiologist, the author of 11 textbooks, the recipient of the V3 Medal of Scientific Excellence 3 times running, a dietary herbivore. This was not a casual opinion. Professor Korath had published it. 41 years ago, as a young researcher, he had submitted a 17,000-word paper to the V3 Journal of Xenobiology entitled Human Omnivore Myth, a reclassification of Homo sapiens as obligate herbivores based on comparative metabolic analysis. The paper had been controversial at the time. It had also been cited 4,000 times since, adopted into the standard curriculum across 7 planetary systems, and referenced in 3 separate interplanetary nutritional treaties. Korath had built a career on it. He had built a reputation on it. He had, in a very real sense, built himself on it. Marcus had read the paper during his first week. He'd read it twice because he'd thought the first time that he must be misunderstanding something. He was not. The paper argued, with considerable formal rigor and a great many footnotes, that the human digestive system lacked the enzymatic complexity necessary for sustained meat consumption, that anthropological evidence of hunting was misattributed cultural performance rather than nutritional practice, and that the presence of canine teeth in the human jaw was a vestigial inheritance from earlier primate ancestors, equivalent in function to the V3 species' own vestigial gill slits, which no living V3 had ever used for anything. Marcus had grown up eating sheep that he had helped his grandmother slaughter on a seasonal basis. He had strong feelings about this paper. He had arrived with the full text downloaded to his personal device and had annotated it across 4 careful readings, each one adding another layer of margin notes, questions, objections, counterexamples. He had cross-referenced the metabolic models against 3 different human medical databases. He had traced the original source material of every citation, following the chain of footnotes the way you follow a river upstream to find out where it stops running true. He had, in week 2, begun compiling what he thought of privately as the counter-archive, a bibliography of peer-reviewed human medical literature, published interspecies nutritional studies, anthropological records from across the settlement colonies, and a complete catalog of the enzymatic analysis work that had been done on human digestive systems in the 4 decades since Korath's paper, none of which reached the same conclusion. It was, he was fairly certain, the most thorough case for the obvious that had ever been assembled in the history of any scientific disagreement. He had also, in week 2, met Professor Korath in person for the first time, in an introductory seminar on interplanetary dietary classification systems, and had spent the hour watching a man who believed, with complete and documented conviction, in something that was straightforwardly wrong. Not carelessly wrong, not lazily wrong. Korath was brilliant and rigorous, and had constructed his error with the same meticulous attention he brought to everything else. He had been wrong with great sophistication, and the error had grown into a cathedral, and you could not simply walk into a cathedral someone had built over 40 years and tell them the foundations were off. You had to, Marcus had decided, around week 3, you had to wait for the moment when the foundations showed themselves. He had not expected the moment to involve a sandwich. He had, however, not yet said any of them out loud, because the paper was in the curriculum, because Professor Korath taught 3 of his required courses, because Marcus was the first human student in the Academy's 400-year history, and he was aware, constantly and with an awareness that felt like pressure applied to the base of his skull, that he was not just himself here. He was the proof of concept. He was the argument for whether humans could do this at all. So he kept his mouth shut. He read the paper. He attended the lectures. He wrote the assignments. He used the word herbivore in the appropriate contexts and kept his mouth shut. Until Thursday. Thursday was the problem with the best of intentions. Thursday was when the Academy cafeteria, which Marcus normally ate in at the early shift before the main student population arrived, was closed for quarterly maintenance between 11 and 1. Thursday was when his regular research schedule had a 2-hour gap right in the middle of the day. Thursday was when Dr. C. Ravine, his assigned academic supervisor, had a faculty seminar running from 10 to 12, which meant her office was empty, which meant the small study alcove outside her office, the one with the window overlooking the gardens and the low table that was approximately the right height for human sitting, was also empty. Marcus settled there with his lunch box, his field notes, and a cup of something warm that the cafeteria had packaged for him the previous day. He opened his notes, he opened his thermos, he opened his lunch box. He had been in the middle of a very focused argument with himself about the mineral content of a particular soil sample when the sound hit him. A controlled, clipped, authoritative footfall he had learned to recognize in 3 months the way certain animals learn to recognize the sound of a predator's breathing. Professor Koreth. Marcus looked up. The professor came around the corner at the head of what appeared to be an entire second-year seminar group. 12 V3 students in the pale gray of first-year study robes, their wide pale eyes moving in the systematic scanning pattern that Marcus had come to understand was their equivalent of nervous attention. Behind them came 2 junior lecturers with data slates. And directly behind the professor, moving with the contained, careful energy of someone who was trying very hard not to make a face, came Dr. Sierra Veen. She was not supposed to be out of her seminar. She was clearly not happy about the detour. She was also, Marcus noticed with the particular acuity of someone who had spent 3 months studying her the way one studies a complex phenomenon that one cannot quite stop thinking about, wearing the expression she wore when she knew something was about to go wrong and couldn't figure out how to stop it. The professor had not yet seen Marcus. He was talking, the way he always talked, in the measured, confident cadences of someone who had given this particular talk so many times it had become reflex. The living quarters corridor was architecturally designed in an earlier century, when the academy anticipated a more diverse enrollment, but of course, he stopped. He had seen Marcus. Marcus had not moved. He was sitting cross-legged on the floor cushion with his lunch box open in his lap, his field notes spread on the low table and in his right hand, because he had been eating when he heard the footsteps and had not yet had time to make a different decision, a roast beef sandwich. It was a very good sandwich. He had made it himself that morning. Dark bread from the Earth Food Cooperative across the city, the beef shipped frozen from a human settlement station, a thin layer of something mustard adjacent that the cooperative had sourced from a plant that wasn't technically a mustard plant, but behaved similarly. He had been looking forward to it since 8 o'clock. He was holding it about 3 inches from his mouth. 12 second-year V3 students stared at it. Professor Koreth stared at it. Dr. Sierra Veen closed her eyes for one very brief moment. Mr. Webb, Professor Koreth said. His voice had not changed in register. This was somehow more alarming than if it had. What is that? It was not phrased as a question. Marcus looked at the sandwich. He looked at the professor. He was aware that there was a version of this moment in which he put the sandwich down, said something diplomatic, and spent the rest of the year invisible in the back of every lecture. He was also aware that he had read that paper twice and spent 4 months eating in the early shift and sitting in chairs that were the wrong size, and had never once in his life before coming here felt the need to apologize for being alive. He took a bite. He chewed it, he swallowed it. Sandwich, he said. The silence that followed was the kind that is weight. There is, Professor Koreth said, very carefully, animal muscle tissue in that preparation. Roast beef, Marcus agreed. I made it myself. That is, the professor stopped, recalibrated. The V3 expression for deep institutional discomfort was a slight tightening at the outer corners of the eyes, a barely perceptible flattening of the lips. Koreth was doing both. Mr. Webb, I think you may be operating under a cultural misconception. Humans are, as the biological literature clearly establishes. Omnivores, Marcus said. Another silence. I beg your pardon. Omnivores. Marcus set the sandwich down on the lunch box lid with the deliberateness of someone who has decided to have this conversation and is committed to it. Humans eat both plant matter and animal protein. We always have. I grew up on a farm. I helped slaughter the sheep. I can describe the process in as much detail as you'd like. One of the second-year students made a sound that was somewhere between a gasp and a click. V3 didn't gasp exactly. It was more of a sharp intake of breath through the nasal passages, but it communicated the same thing. Professor Korath drew himself up. He was tall the way most V3 were tall, long-limbed and precise, and he had the additional height of certainty. The literature on human dietary classification is quite clear, Mr. Webb. Your species' digestive capacity for animal protein is well documented in the medical records of 8 billion humans, Marcus said. I'd be happy to cite them. I've actually been compiling a bibliography since week 2, when I realized this was in the curriculum. He reached into his field notes and produced, because he had in fact been compiling a bibliography since week 2, a list. He set it on the table beside his sandwich. Korath looked at it. He did not pick it up. Those sources, he said, are from human institutions. They are subject to the same observational biases that have historically led your species to misrepresent their own diet, Marcus said. Yes, I know, that's the argument in your paper. I've read your paper. Then you understand. I understand the argument. I disagree with the methodology. Marcus folded his hands on the table. He was calmer than he'd expected to be. There was something clarifying about finally saying the thing out loud. The enzymatic analysis in your 2283 study used tissue samples from a single cadaver, one human. The metabolic modeling was based on that one subject's enzyme levels, which I would note were documented post-mortem after what the medical file describes as a prolonged illness affecting gastrointestinal function. That's in the original source material. In the footnotes. Footnote 19. Korath had gone very still, the kind of still that the V3 did when they were thinking hard. Your entire reclassification of human dietary biology, Marcus continued in the same even tone, is built on one sick body. From behind the cluster of second-year students, very quietly, Dr. C. Ravine made a sound. It was not quite a laugh. It was the sound a laugh makes when it is being very thoroughly suppressed. Marcus had not expected what happened next. He had expected, in a rough way, to be reprimanded, possibly to be removed from the seminar group's path, possibly to receive a formal notation on his academic file. He had not expected Professor Korath to turn on his heel and walk away without another word, or for the second-year students to follow in a ripple of uncertain movement, or for Dr. C. Ravine to remain behind. She stood in the corridor for a moment after the others had gone. Then she walked to the low table, looked at his bibliography, and sat down on the floor cushion across from him. This was remarkable. The V3 did not, as a rule, sit on the floor. Their joints were structured differently. It looked deeply uncomfortable. She picked up the bibliography, she read it, she set it down. You've been sitting on this for 4 months, she said. I've been compiling it for 4 months, Marcus said. I've been sitting on it for 4 months, yes. She looked at him. Her eyes were a particular shade of silver pale that he had spent a disproportionate amount of time not thinking about. Why? Because I didn't want to be the human who caused a problem on his first semester. And now, he called me a herbivore in front of 12 students, Marcus said, in front of my own sandwich. Something moved across her face. He had been learning her expressions for 3 months, the way you learn a new language, one word at a time, until the meaning starts arriving before you've consciously translated it. This one was something between amusement and something more complicated, something that looked, if he was reading it right, like relief. Footnote 19, she said. Footnote 19. She was quiet for a moment. Then, I knew about footnote 19. He looked at her. How long have you known? Since I was a doctoral student. She set the bibliography down. Her hands were very still on it, the way V3 hands went still when they were being careful. Professor Korath supervised my dissertation. He has been one of the most influential scholars in this field for longer than I have been alive. His work is in every curriculum on 11 planets. His opinion decides which research gets funded and which doesn't. His support determines careers. And his paper is built on one sick body. Yes, the word came out like something that had been held too long. It is. Marcus looked at her for a long time. Outside the window, the academy gardens moved in the slow, gold-lit rhythm of an alien afternoon. "You have the data," he said. It wasn't a question. He had been watching her for 3 months. He had watched the way she paused before answering certain questions in seminars. The way she built her own teaching around established literature, with a precision that left no gaps for alternative evidence to enter. The way she sometimes looked at the curriculum materials with an expression that was absolutely not the expression of someone who agreed with them. She was quiet. "Dr. Veen," he said, "Sierra." It was the first time he had used her given name. She noticed. He could tell she noticed. "What kind of data," he said carefully, "does a doctoral student collect when they're working under the foremost authority on human dietary biology?" She looked at him. "Field data," she said finally. "From the first and only academic expedition to a human agricultural settlement, 42 years ago. 6 months of observational research. And the settlement's weekly slaughter schedule was on day 3 of our arrival." She paused. The V3 members of the expedition were distressed. Koreth excluded the observations from the published findings. He classified the raw data archive as methodologically compromised. Because it contradicted his paper. Because it would have destroyed it. She looked at her hands. He classified it, filed it in the Academy's memory archive system, and locked it under his researcher credentials. No one has accessed it in 41 years. The lockout period under Academy data governance is 50 years. In 9 years, the archive automatically releases. And in the meantime, every xenobiology curriculum in 11 planetary systems teaches that humans don't eat meat. Yes. Marcus sat with that for a moment. "Where's the archive?" he said. She looked up at him. The expression on her face was something he had not seen from her before, something unguarded, a little frightened, and under the fear, something that looked like the feeling of a decision already half-made. "You want to break into an Academy memory archive," she said. "I want to access suppressed scientific data that has been withheld from the scholarly record for 41 years, Marcus said. "I have a bibliography. I have a sandwich. I feel like I'm on a productive streak." The not-quite laugh happened again. This time she let a little more of it out. "The archive system," she said slowly, "operates on the same memory encryption standard as the Academy's general research database. Every licensed researcher has a credential token. The restricted archives require the original depositor's token, but the Academy Governance Code also allows access under one other condition." She paused. "Active dispute proceedings. If a formal academic dispute is filed over the validity of published research, the evidence archive becomes accessible to the disputing party's appointed representative." "How do I file a formal academic dispute?" "You need a sponsoring faculty member." He looked at her. She looked at him. "I have office hours," she said carefully, "from 3 to 5. The formal academic dispute process at the V3 Academy was, Dr. Veen had warned him, not designed to move quickly. It had been established in an era when scholarly disagreements were expected to resolve themselves across generations. There were forms. There were response periods. There were procedural review committees that met on schedules calibrated to the assumption that no one was in a hurry. Marcus filed the dispute at 3:15 Thursday afternoon, with Dr. Sierra Veen listed as sponsoring faculty. By 3:40, Professor Koreth had been notified. By 4, Marcus had received a summons to appear before the department chair. He had been in the chair's office once before, during his enrollment intake. It was a large room with walls that held the memory inscriptions of every department chair going back 200 years. A V3 tradition, the relevant facts of each administrator's tenure crystallized into encoded data panels set into the stone. The current chair, Dr. Marath, was old and precise, and had the practiced stillness of someone who had been managing institutional crises for 40 years. She had also, Marcus noted, read the bibliography. It was open on her desk. "You have filed a dispute under Academy Governance Article 17, she said, without preamble, against the foundational dietary classification study of Professor Korath, on the basis of methodological error in the original sample set." "Yes," Marcus said. "Professor Korath has submitted a counter-objection. He characterizes your basis for dispute as," she looked at the document, "culturally motivated species bias." "He said that the paper is wrong," Sierra said from the chair beside Marcus. She had come with him. He hadn't asked her to. She had simply been there when he left her office. "The original sample was compromised. The evidence is in the restricted archive." "The archive is sealed." "The archive is accessible under Article 17, Sierra said. Her voice was very steady. "I've reviewed the governance code. The dispute gives the appointed faculty representative access to the relevant restricted data. I am Mr. Webb's appointed faculty representative." A silence. "Dr. Veen," the chair said carefully, "you understand what you're doing." "I understand the governance procedure," Sierra said. "I'm following it." Marath looked at her for a long time. Then she looked at Marcus. Then she looked at the bibliography. "The archive access requires my authorization code," she said finally. "I will grant it. You will have 6 hours." The Academy's memory archive system was housed 3 levels below the main building, in a climate-controlled vault that smelled faintly of old electrical systems and cold stone. The interface terminals were older than most of the Academy's other technology, designed when memory archiving was new and treated with the reverence you give to a thing you don't fully understand yet. The screens were amber-tinted the same shade as the ceiling panels above, and the encoding interface had the unhurried quality of a system that had been built by people who expected it to last several centuries and had not been wrong. They went down together, Marcus with his bibliography in his jacket pocket and Sierra with the chair's authorization code on a secured data chip, and both of them moving with the particular quiet of people who have committed to something and are not going to examine it again until they're on the other side of it. The archive entry required 3 separate credential verifications: the chair's authorization code, Sierra's faculty token, a time-stamped intent log that would be visible to the governance committee. They were not doing this quietly. They were doing it correctly, in the full light of the governance record, which was the only way to do it if you wanted the outcome to hold. At the final screen, Sierra paused. Her hands were on the interface panel, very still. "When the archive releases the restricted data," she said, "Korath will be notified automatically." "I know," Marcus said. "He will have 2 hours to submit a counter-petition before we can copy anything." "I know. He will use those 2 hours." "He will," Marcus agreed. "And then it will be in the record regardless, and he can petition for the next 40 years and the data will still be there." She looked at him sidelong. "You've read the governance code." "I've been waiting for the right footnote since week 2, he said. "I read everything." She made a sound, not the suppressed laugh exactly, something quieter and more private, and pressed the final authorization. Dr. Veen had the access code. Marcus had his bibliography and his field notes, and the photograph he'd been carrying in his front pocket since his mother pressed it into his hands the day he left a farm at sunrise, his grandmother in the foreground, her hands on the shoulder of a sheep with an air of quiet authority. He didn't know why he'd brought it to the archive. He took it out anyway and set it on the console beside the terminal while Sierra worked the access protocol. She paused, looked at the photograph, looked at him. "Your grandmother," he said. "Annual slaughter week. That was the Sunday before, so she's still—" He stopped. "She was a very practical woman." Sierra looked at the photograph for another moment. "She looks like someone who says things out loud," she said. "That's exactly right," Marcus said. She turned back to the terminal. "I'm in," she said quietly. The archive unspooled across the screen in the V3 data format, layered, encoded, organized by date and researcher credential the way memory, real memory, is organized by association and weight. 41 years of locked data. The expedition records were at the beginning, flagged as classified. The flag itself dated to the week after the expedition returned. She opened the first file. And there it was, the slaughter records, the dietary observation logs. 6 months of meticulous documentation. What the humans ate, how often, in what quantities, across an entire agricultural settlement of 214 people. The protein consumption data alone was enough. There were medical records attached, voluntary submissions from the settlement's clinic, gut microbiome analyses, digestive enzyme profiles from 17 individual subjects across 3 age groups. 17 subjects, Marcus said softly. Against Korath's 1, Sierra said. 17 healthy subjects with complete enzyme panels showing. He leaned closer. Full proteolytic capacity, primary and secondary enzyme pathways both active, consistent with a species that has been metabolizing animal protein for several 100,000 years of evolutionary history, Sierra finished. She was reading faster now, her pale eyes moving across the data with the focused speed of someone who had been waiting 40 years for this. The metabolic modeling he should have used. It was all here. He had all of it. She stopped at a note in the file. A researcher's note, dated 6 months after the expedition. A note that had never been included in any publication. "I recommend against the reclassification. The observational and biological evidence does not support it. Dr. Elvine, senior researcher." Marcus looked at her. She was very still. "Veen," he said, "Dr. Elvine." "My aunt," she said. Her voice was even, very even, the way a voice gets when something behind it is not. She was a senior researcher on the expedition. She retired 12 years ago. She told me when I was a student and I came to her with questions about certain inconsistencies in the literature. She told me to trust the established record and not make trouble. A pause. I think she was trying to protect me. "She was right that it was trouble," Marcus said. "She was right that it was trouble," Sierra agreed. She looked at the note for a long moment. Then she began copying files. The committee convened at 8 the following morning in the main seminar hall. Marcus had not slept much. He had gone home to his residential cell and sat on the sleeping platform he'd spent week 1 modifying and looked at the photograph for a while, and then started going through the archive data again, line by line, not because he was uncertain about it, but because he wanted to know it the way you know something you're going to say in a room full of people who know the subject better than almost anyone alive. He suspected Sierra hadn't slept either. She arrived with the careful composure of someone who had made a decision somewhere in the dark hours and was now committed to the side of it that couldn't be taken back. She was wearing the formal gray of a faculty presenter, her silver hair pulled back in the manner that meant official function. She looked, he thought, like someone walking toward something they had been circling for a very long time. There were 7 people on the committee besides Chair Marath. 4 senior faculty from the biology division, 2 external reviewers from the Academy's partner institution on the neighboring orbital station, and 1 emeritus professor who had been brought in specifically, because she predated Korath's paper by 30 years and had, according to a notation Marcus had found in the Academy's faculty record, submitted a dissenting comment on the original peer review that had been overruled by 3 senior editors. The emeritus professor was 91 years old and had the stillness of someone who had long since stopped spending energy on things that were not worth it. She had read the bibliography. He could tell because she had it in front of her at the table with several handwritten notations in the margin, made in the compressed, careful script of someone who had been annotating documents for 7 decades. Professor Korath arrived last. He was accompanied by 2 colleagues, and he moved with the absolute certainty of a man who had not yet understood that the ground had shifted. He looked at Marcus with a controlled, professional contempt that had been 41 years in the making. "This proceeding," he said, before anyone had called the room to order, "is premature. The dispute filing lacks the substantive basis required under Article 17. The archive access has already been granted," Chair Marath said, from the head of the table, "and has already been exercised." Korath looked at Sierra. Sierra looked at Korath. She had the data files on a presentation board. She stood up. "I want to start," she said, "with footnote 19. She walked them through it methodically. The single subject sample, the documented illness in the original subject's medical file, the post-mortem enzymatic analysis, the margin of error in the metabolic modeling that had never been disclosed. She did it without drama and without hurry, the way a scientist presents evidence, one brick at a time, each one mortared in place before the next is set. Then she opened the expedition archive. The data from 41 years ago came up on the room's main display: 17 subjects, 6 months, complete metabolic profiles. Dr. L. Veen's recommendation note appeared at the end. The committee members were quiet for a long time. The emeritus professor turned a page. She did not look up from the bibliography for another 30 seconds, during which the room was completely still in the V3 way, the deep, thoughtful silence that wasn't the silence of discomfort, but the silence of minds working. Then she set the bibliography down and looked at Sierra. "The recommendation note," she said, "Dr. Lyra Veen." "My aunt," Sierra said. "She was a junior researcher on the expedition. She is currently retired." The emeritus professor looked at Marcus. "She filed a dissenting recommendation 41 years ago." "Yes," Marcus said. "I filed a dissenting comment on the original peer review." She paused. "It was not well received." She picked up her annotated copy of the bibliography. "The footnote 19 issue was not in my comment. I was working from the published version of the sample data, which had been cleaned. I did not know the source material was compromised." The room was quiet again. Korath had not moved. He was looking at his own suppressed data with the expression of a man who knows exactly what he is looking at, and had believed, for 41 years, that no one else ever would. "The expedition data was classified due to methodological irregularities," he said. His voice was steady. "You had to give him that. 41 years had made his position a part of him, and he was still holding it, and you could respect the steadiness even when you could not respect the position. The observational conditions were not controlled for. The subjects didn't know they were being observed for dietary analysis," Marcus said. "That's why the data is valid. They weren't performing a diet. They were just eating. The classification was within my rights as the depositing researcher." "To suppress evidence that contradicted your published findings," Sierra said. "Yes. Technically within the governance code as it existed 41 years ago. The code has since been revised." She turned to the chair. "Section 7, Amendment 12, passed 18 years ago. A researcher may not classify field data collected during an academy-funded expedition if that data has direct bearing on the researcher's published conclusions. It was written specifically to prevent this kind of thing from happening again, because it had already happened twice before." Marcus had not known that. He looked at her. She had not mentioned it last night, which meant she had found it sometime between midnight and 8 in the morning. He made a note to himself, not for the first time, about the things she was capable of when she had decided to be. Korath looked at him. You are a first-year student who eats meat, Marcus said, along with 8 billion other humans, along with the 214 humans who were documented doing it over 6 months in this archive, along with every human who has ever lived, who ate what we ate because we are what we are, and no one asked Professor Korath's permission. The room was quiet. The emeritus professor, who had been making another notation in the margin of the bibliography, said, without looking up, "The methodology is indefensible. It has always been indefensible. The reclassification should never have been published." She capped her pen. "I recommend immediate formal review of the published paper and all derivative curriculum materials, with a timeline for correction and reissue." A silence. "The reclassification," Chair Marath said after a moment, "will need to be reviewed." "The curriculum," one of the committee members said slowly, "on 11 planets." "Will need to be reviewed," Marath said again. "Dr. Veen, I will be recommending you to chair the review committee. That is a significant time commitment. I want to be certain you understand what you're accepting." "I understand," Sierra said. "Yes." Korath said nothing. He looked, for the first time in Marcus's experience of him, like something had been removed from him. Not a defeat exactly, but a weight he had been carrying for so long he had stopped feeling it, and now felt only its absence, the unfamiliar lightness of a thing that finally rests. He was old and he had built something and it was wrong, and those two things were both true and would both remain true, and Marcus found, to his own surprise, that he could not make himself enjoy it. That was the thing about the truth. It wasn't about winning. It was just about the truth being there, on the record, in the place where it should have been 41 years ago. Marcus did not feel triumphant. He felt something quieter than that, the particular stillness that comes after a thing has been said that needed saying, and the room has not caught fire, and the world is continuing. He found Sierra afterward in the corridor, outside the seminar hall. She was standing at the window that looked over the same gardens as the alcove outside her office, watching the morning light move across the amber-leaf trees that the academy planted along the south wall every spring. She heard him coming. Her hearing was better than human. V3 auditory biology ran several registers higher, and she turned before he reached her. She looked different. He'd been cataloging her expressions for 3 months, one careful word at a time, and this was one he hadn't seen before. It wasn't relief exactly, though there was relief in it. It wasn't triumph. It was the expression of someone who has set down something heavy and discovered that their hands work differently without it. "My aunt is going to hear about this," she said. "Is that good or bad?" "Both." She was quiet for a moment. She spent her whole career in Korath's department. She suppressed her own recommendation because the alternative was to be the junior researcher who destroyed the most influential paper in the field, written by her supervisor, who had the authority to end her career before it started. She paused. She made the choice she made. I don't think she was wrong to make it. The system was designed to make that choice. "Is that why you made the one you made?" Marcus asked. She looked at him. The morning light came through the amber panels and did something to the silver of her skin that he had been very careful not to think about too specifically. "I made the choice I made because the data was there," she said. "And because someone was already committed to saying the thing out loud." A pause. "You were eating a sandwich. It was a very good sandwich." "I know. You looked like you'd been looking forward to it all morning." "I had been looking forward to it all morning." She made the not quite laugh sound. This time she let all of it out, and it was different from the suppressed version, fuller, less careful, the laugh of someone who has stopped managing something. "Marcus," she said. It was the first time she had used his given name. He waited. "The committee's review will take several months," she said. "There will be a formal recommendation to the curriculum oversight bodies on all 11 planets. There will be a significant amount of institutional friction." She paused. I will likely be appointed to the review committee, and Korath's department will need new supervision for several of its research programs. Will you take it? I think I will be asked to, she said, and I think I will say yes. He nodded. He was looking at her and she was looking at him, and they were both being very careful in exactly the same direction, which he had found, over the last 3 months, was usually what it looked like from the outside when two people were doing the same thing. My aunt, she said after a moment, will also want to meet you. She will want to know who it was that finally, she stopped. She said once when I asked her why she didn't fight it, she said that fighting it required someone who had nothing to lose. A junior researcher has everything to lose. A first-year exchange student from a farming settlement who has already decided he doesn't belong here. I never decided I didn't belong here, Marcus said. She looked at him. I knew the chairs were the wrong size and the cafeteria schedule didn't line up, and I was the only human in the building, and I ate in the early shift for 4 months, so I didn't make trouble, he said. But I didn't decide I didn't belong. I was waiting to decide. He paused. I think I might have decided. The light through the amber panels was warm on both of them. She was looking at him with the expression he hadn't seen before, and he was reading it now, word by word, the way you read a new language when the meaning starts arriving before you've consciously translated it. You're going to have to eat in the main cafeteria now, she said. On a normal schedule, the whole academy will want to watch. Will you eat with me? She was quiet for one moment. Then, yes, she said, I will eat with you. He reached into his jacket pocket, a habit that had survived the entire morning's crisis. He had a second sandwich. He'd made 2 that morning, old farming settlement habit, always make more than you need. He held it out. She looked at it. The dark bread, the thin sliced beef, the mustard-adjacent spread. She looked at him. I don't, she paused. V3 don't. I know, Marcus said, but the bread is good, and the rest is optional. She took it. She turned it over in her long-fingered hands with the careful attention she gave to everything unfamiliar and new. She pulled the bread layer back. She smelled the filling. He could see the slight widening of her nasal passages, the V3 equivalent of leaning in, and made a sound he couldn't quite categorize. What does it taste like, she said. The beef. Depends on how it's cooked, he said. This is roasted. It tastes warm, rich, like something that takes a while. He paused, like something that was worth the effort. She looked at him over the sandwich. He looked back. All right, she said, teach me. The review process took 6 months. It was not pleasant in the institutional sense. Professor Korath submitted 3 formal counter-challenges, each one requiring a response, each one reviewed by a committee that had to be convened, scheduled, and then rescheduled because of conflicts with other committee meetings, because the academy had been doing things this way for 400 years and was not about to become efficient on Marcus Webb's account. There were hearings. There were depositions. There were moments when Marcus sat in procedural review sessions that had been going for 3 hours and considered, briefly, whether the chairs in human institutions had been correctly sized all along, and he had simply never appreciated it. But there were also the other things. There was the morning in week 8 of the review process when Marcus arrived at the cafeteria at the regular hour, not the early shift, the main shift with the rest of the students, and found that someone had moved one of the chairs. It was a human-scaled chair, clearly salvaged from somewhere in the residential wing, positioned at the end of one of the study tables. Not placed in a corner, not tucked out of the way. Just there, the right height, at a regular table like it had always been there. He didn't know who had done it. He sat down. He ate his breakfast. 3 V3 students at the other end of the table did not move or look up, which was either indifference or the V3 version of deliberate courtesy, and he had learned enough by then to read it as the latter. The week after that, 2 more chairs, different tables. By week 12, the exchange student forum, the one where the practical solutions lived, updated by a chain of previous humans going back 12 years, had a new entry. He had written it himself. A note on the cafeteria chair situation, the schedule changes that had been accommodated, the specific study alcoves that had low tables suitable for floor sitting in a pinch. He had written it at 11 at night after a long session reviewing archival data with Sierra, and he had included at the end a sentence that was not strictly practical information. The academy is old and it changes slowly, but it does change. He had not expected a reply for weeks. He got one the next morning from a human doctoral student who had left 8 years ago and apparently still checked the forum. This is the first time in 12 years that anyone has updated the chair section. Thank you. I hope it's different now. It was different now. It was in the process of becoming different, which is the same thing seen from the inside. Dr. Lyra Veen, Sierra's aunt, retired, sharp as anything Marcus had ever encountered, came to the academy in the second month. She was 60 years older than her niece and shared her stillness and her eyes and her habit of going completely motionless when she was parsing something carefully. She sat across from Marcus in the same garden alcove where he'd eaten his sandwich and looked at him for a while before she said anything. "You read footnote 19, she said finally. "I read the whole paper," he said, "twice." "No one reads footnote 19. I was looking for something to argue with. I read very carefully when I'm looking for something to argue with." She was quiet. Then, "I wrote my recommendation and I filed it and Korath classified the entire archive, and I left his department, and I spent 30 years publishing in other areas. And I told myself it didn't matter because in 50 years the archive would release, and the data would be available and eventually someone would read footnote 19, Marcus said. "Eventually," she agreed. She looked at him with the particular directness of someone who has stopped being surprised by most things. "You're not what I expected." "What did you expect?" "I don't know," she said. "Something that looks more like a disruption, a confrontation, a declaration." She paused. Sierra described it as, he took a bite of his sandwich and said the word omnivore and showed Korath a bibliography. "That's accurate." She said you looked like someone who had been waiting to say that word for a long time and was glad to finally say it. "Omnivore," Marcus said. "Yes, for months I was overdue." She almost smiled. The expression was very like Sierra's, same architecture, different wear, the smile of someone who has learned to hold things a little more lightly. "You were trying to eat lunch," she agreed. "And you were willing to say the thing out loud, and you had the bibliography to back it up." She paused. "Sierra says you had the bibliography in week 2. "I had started it in week 2, yes." "She says you never showed it to anyone." "I showed it to the professor, eventually." "You showed it to her first." He thought about that. "I showed it to the situation," he said. "She was part of the situation." Lyra Veen looked out at the garden. The amberleaf trees were different this month, later in the season, the leaves shifting toward something more red at the edges. "She's going to be the youngest department chair in the academy's history," she said. "If they confirm her for the review committee chair, which they will, and then for the department restructuring, which follows." "She knows that." "I know she knows that," Marcus said. "She'll be very busy," the older woman said. "Not quite a warning. Not quite anything except the observation of someone who is mapping terrain carefully." "I'm planning to stay for the full degree program," Marcus said. 4 years, that's the standard enrollment." Lyra Veen looked at him for a long moment. Then she picked up the cup of warm drink he'd brought her from the cafeteria. He'd learned in the first week which cafeteria offerings translated across species diets, and she took a sip and she said, "The bread in this institution has always been exceptional." "It has," Marcus agreed. They sat with that. The curriculum revision took longer than the internal review. That was the thing about building a wrong idea into 11 planetary educational systems. Dismantling it required the cooperation of 11 different curriculum boards, 8 of which required independent confirmation of the evidence package, 6 of which had to be persuaded that updating established literature was not in itself an admission of failure, and 3 of which attempted to negotiate a middle position in which humans were classified as facultative omnivores with significant individual variation, a category that Sierra dispatched in a single committee session with the precision and patience of someone cutting down a badly constructed argument. Marcus sat in on that session. He sat in on all of them when he could in the back of the room with his field notes and his lunch. He was doing his degree. He was taking his courses, which were now taught by faculty who had read the expedition data and were quietly, professionally rearranging their understanding of an entire species. He ate his lunch in the main cafeteria on a normal schedule, and if the V3 students watched him with the intent, careful attention of people studying a phenomenon in real time, he had stopped finding that difficult. He had decided something that happened here. He was a part of the Academy's record now in whatever way the record worked. Not a disruption, not a proof of concept, just someone who had read the footnotes. On the last day of the curriculum revision vote, the final board, the formal adoption of the corrected dietary classification, the removal of Korath's reclassification from the standard curriculum across all 11 systems, Marcus was in his regular study alcove working on a soil sample analysis when the door of Sierra's office opened, and she came out and sat down across from him on the floor cushion. She sat on the floor cushions now without comment. She had stopped finding it uncomfortable in month 3. Around the same time she had started eating lunch with him on a regular basis and had worked her way through, with methodical scientific curiosity, every permutation of the roast beef sandwich. Conclusions. The dark bread was essential. The mustard-adjacent substance was an acquired taste that she had not yet acquired. The beef itself was, and this was her word, dense, in the way that things which took effort to make are dense. She had the final vote count on her data slate. She set it down on the table between them. Marcus looked at it, then he looked at her. She was doing the expression again. The one from the corridor that morning after the first committee session, the one that looked like a weight being set down. He had seen it at intervals since then, appearing and disappearing depending on what the day had been, but it was more settled now, less like relief and more like an arrival. "It passed," she said. "I know," he said. "I could tell when you came out." She looked at him. "How?" "You came and sat down," he said. "You sit down when things go right. When they go wrong, you stand in the doorway." She was quiet for a moment. Outside, the light through the amber panels had the particular quality of late afternoon in the Academy's season, gold-leaning, long-shadowed, the kind of light that makes everything look like it's been there a long time and intends to stay. "Marcus," she said. "Yes. I want to ask you something." He waited. "The photograph," she said. "Your grandmother, you brought it to the archive." "I carry it everywhere." "I know," she paused. "I've seen it in your jacket pocket. You take it out sometimes when you're thinking about something. You don't seem to notice you're doing it." He hadn't noticed he was doing it. He looked down. His hand was, in fact, in his jacket pocket, the photograph between his fingers. "She died 3 years ago," he said. "Before I got the Academy acceptance, I always thought," he stopped, started again. "I always thought she would have liked this, the whole thing. She was very practical about death and difficulty. She thought they were, she said once, that the things worth doing are usually the ones that require you to say something out loud that you'd rather keep quiet." Sierra looked at him for a long time. She had the data slate in her hands, but she wasn't looking at it. "I want to meet your family," she said. He looked up. "I am going to be department chair," she said. "For the next, possibly the rest of my career. And you are going to finish your degree, and then I expect you will do a postdoctoral program because you are thorough and I have seen how you work, and you will want the additional years to properly document whatever you decide to study. And I will be very busy, and so will you, and I have thought about how that works." She paused. "I have thought about it quite a lot." "Have you reached a conclusion?" he said. "I want to meet your family," she said again. "I want to see the farm. I want to understand where you come from. What made you the kind of person who reads footnote 19 and comes in with a bibliography in week 2 and sits on it for 4 months and then eats a sandwich?" She looked at him. "I want to understand all of that." He was looking at her. She was looking at him. The light came through the amber panels, and the academy was quiet around them, with the particular quiet of a place that is old and has seen many things, and has simply added this to its count. "The farm is not complicated," he said. "My mother will feed you an enormous amount of food and ask you questions for 6 straight hours, and my uncle will show you the water reclamation system, because he's very proud of it, and my cousin will want to know everything about your academic work, because she applied to a xenobiology program last year and didn't get in and is recalibrating." She stopped. "That sounds like a great deal of people." "It's a family," Marcus said. "They take up space." She looked at him. And there it was again, the expression, fully out, nothing suppressed about it, the one that meant something he had known the meaning of for a while and had been waiting, because she was worth waiting for her to say. "I like things that take up space," she said, "when they're worth it." He reached into his lunch box. He had, because some habits were worth keeping, made an extra sandwich. He held it out. She took it without looking at it. She was still looking at him. "Worth it," he said, "is relative." "I'm a scientist," she said. "I understand relative." She looked down at the sandwich. She looked up at him. "Marcus." "Yes." "The mustard-adjacent substance," she said. "I think I've acquired the taste." He laughed too loud, the way he always laughed, not apologetic about it anymore. She smiled, and it was the fully released version of the expression that had started 3 months ago in 100 small moments and one very good sandwich, as something suppressed and careful, and was now, in the amber light of the academy at the end of a long day, exactly what it had always been wanting to become. Outside, the season was changing. The amber-leaf trees along the south wall were going red at the edges, the kind of red that happens when something has been gold for long enough and is ready to become something else. The light through the amber panels had shifted too, colder at the periphery, the angle lower, the whole quality of the afternoon tilted towards something that felt, on Vether Prime in the 4th month of the academic year, like the beginning of something longer. Somewhere in the Academy's memory archive, 3 levels below, the expedition data from 41 years ago sat unlocked and correctly classified, its weight redistributed at last. The record was different now. Dr. Lyra Veen's recommendation had been restored to the file, properly indexed. The 17 subjects had their enzyme profiles correctly attributed. The 6 months of observation existed in the record the way they should have always existed, not classified, not weighted with a label that meant *inconvenient*, but simply there, doing what good data always does when it finally gets to, telling the truth about the thing it measured. In 9 years, the standard archive release would have made it available automatically. Instead, it was available now, 447 weeks early, because a first-year student had been eating a sandwich and had decided, holding it 3 inches from his mouth, that this was the moment. His grandmother would have had a great deal to say about that. He could hear it, the precise tone of her voice when she found something funny that she intended to pretend she didn't find funny. He took out the photograph and looked at it for a moment, and then put it back. The lunch box sat between them on the low table. Sierra was looking at the data vote count on her slate. He was looking at her. She felt him looking, she always did, that V3 auditory acuity catching the small shift in his attention, and she looked up, and the expression was still there, the fully released version, nothing suppressed. "Marcus," she said. "I know," he said. She smiled. "You don't know what I was going to say. You were going to say that we should go find something to eat, somewhere with a table the right height and enough light and enough time." She looked at him for a moment. "I was going to say all of that," she agreed. "Yes." Neither of them was finished eating. Neither of them was in any hurry to be.